Last week we read some pieces about human nature in intersection with religion and science. I talked about sociobiology. This week we'll continue to talk about human nature, and your assigned reading is a piece by myself on the cognitive science of religion. And if you have questions as you're reading that, do feel free to get in touch with me. There are many ways that scholars study human nature. The general term for the study of human nature comes from Greek, and it's the word anthropology. Anthropos being the Greek word for human being. And anthropology, if we just talk about it as a particular discipline within the academy, within the university, it's a social science. So it's looking at human culture. Physical anthropology, by contrast, traditionally has been looking at the evolution of humans, different forms of humans, and getting down to us, our particular species of Homo sapiens. We can also talk about theological or religious anthropology, philosophical anthropology, different ways of studying the nature of who we are as human beings. There are also some kind of new disciplines within science that study human nature as well. Cognitive science, neuroscience, allied with that, artificial intelligence. Also, there's ethology, the study of animals and looking at how other animals are similar as well as different from us human beings. Last week, you might remember being introduced to my beagle, Molly. And I did want to say a little bit more about kind of the evolution of dogs and compare that a little bit to in terms or tie that in a little bit to our own evolution. But we talked about how dogs evolved to be they are naturally social, unlike cats, but they evolved to be very social with us human beings in particular. We artificially selected those wolves that were kind of friendlier, and we actually tried to breed what we'd call juvenile traits in them, the traits that younger wolves would have. And that has gone so well that dogs are able to understand us and understand our signals, the messages that we send, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in amazing ways. One experiment showed how if you have a couple bowls, say, and you put a treat under one of the bowls and not under the other, you move them around and you make sure there's no odor for the dog to sniff. And the person running the experiment points to one of the bowls, a dog invariably will pick up that message and go to the bowl and tip over the bowl with a treat. Do the same thing with chimpanzees, our closest relative. They are clueless. They cannot read such a signal at all. And don't quote me on this, but I think even young children aren't as good at reading that type of signal as a dog is. Speaking about our own evolution from chimpanzees, we know that the common ancestor to them and us existed about 4 to 5 billion, million years ago, certainly not billion, million years ago, and that ancestor became extinct. But as we've mentioned, there were many species of humans who came out of that, and there are also, at least surviving today, 2 species, chimpanzees and bonobos, who look very similar, but there are some important differences. Chimpanzees tend to be more aggressive. The male chimpanzees, like young males, they'll go out in a group, and if they catch a young male from another group of chimpanzees, they will attempt and often succeed in killing that what they consider a rival group chimpanzee. And they tend to, we talked about species where we have one dominant male who gets most or all of the female companionship. But bonobos are quite the opposite. They're the make love, not war type of ape. And when they have disagreements or just want to exchange some social interaction, they often stroke each other sexually. So this is the kind of R-rated, maybe X-rated portion of the mini lecture today. All right, the main instrument for my talk today will be a PowerPoint that you have on Canvas, and I'll ideally you might have handy a copy of this on your screen that you can click to as needed, or maybe you've printed out a copy like I have, and I'll put up a copy of this as we move the pages of the PowerPoint. This particular presentation is entitled Consciousness, the Final Frontier, the Religious Implications of Cognitive Science and Neuroscience. One thing we can say is when it comes to studying human nature from these scientific perspectives, there is no more dualism. Descartes was the person who at least gets the major blame, and probably rightly so, for kind of separating, for splitting mind and body, mind and matter. So our mind is, our consciousness is this unextended, non-extended substance, reality, and our body and other material objects are extended in space. So what are the alternatives to dualism, which generally is not very popular today among scholars of all kinds of stripes, not just scientists, but theologians, philosophers in general, and so on? Well, the alternatives, and I'll put up this sheet for a moment here for those that might not have handy access to it right now as you're listening. There's materialism or physicalism, meaning that well, not only that everything is matter and energy, or just everything is just physical, but often when these terms are used, we're talking about a reductive physicalism or reductive materialism. That is, basically, any reality can be reduced to its smallest, the lowest level of its physical components. And higher levels all are basically totally dependent on the lower levels, and causation kind of just moves from the bottom up. Some really extreme forms of this, when it comes to consciousness, are called, and they even do call themselves, eliminative materialists or physicalists. That means they are saying that our consciousness, our mental states, are actually a type of illusion. We have this false sense that the consciousness is something real. So in that sense, they even eliminate consciousness. A related way of talking about that is to call consciousness an epiphenomenon of the neural machinery of our brains. An epiphenomenon is, again, an illusion, and it does no work. And our sense that maybe it's important or that it does anything is again false. Mention another alternative of naturalism, and naturalism, it can mean the same thing as physicalism or materialism, but it generally has a less negative, a less reductionistic connotation. And so it's really saying that our consciousness is not something supernatural. It's not like we have this physical world and then somehow God supplies this supernatural mind or spirit that gives us consciousness. Now, the strongest alternative, and it can be naturalistic or is naturalistic, would be the idea of emergence. That consciousness emerges from these lower factors like our individual cells, our neurons, the electrical currents that are exchanged among neurons, and so on, within a self-organizing system. And we've talked about self-organizing systems before, so there is in some sense a self, a subject, so it's not going, the emergence is not going to eliminate our sense of consciousness the way a reductionism does. Now, there can be, as I show on the PowerPoint, there can be weak understandings of emergence where still it really does talk about higher levels that do things, or in some sense they can even cause things, but the causation always comes from the bottom up. And so a higher level, including our kind of our own awareness of our consciousness, our own decision making, is never a cause, or never, it's not like free will would be possible in this model. It all comes from below. And then there's strong emergence, which allows for some top-down causation. The higher level is very dependent, so there's causation coming from our, in this case, our neurons, the synapses among our neurons, and all of that. But the higher level of our conscious awareness sometimes causes things to happen at the lower levels in our brain, in our bodies, in the world, as we make various decisions. All right, let's get to the next page of the PowerPoint. So we're going to talk about cognitive science. And this involves, as I've already been saying, anthropology. We're studying human beings from various perspectives, and ethology, studying animals, sometimes to compare them to us, computer modeling, and we'll talk about computational models of consciousness in a bit, artificial intelligence, how that might relate to our own consciousness, and maybe someday, now externally, maybe more internally, kind of melding together our own brain and some artificial computer kind of things that are involved in our consciousness. Neuroscience, studying all about what goes on in our brain, and I should say that's a kind of prejudice to kind of just think about the brain and the mind, because neuroscience also involves the nerves throughout our body and the interaction between brain and all the feelings, the neurons and feelings we have throughout our bodies. Also, linguistics and language. The human language is a huge thing that differentiates us from other animals. Psychology, especially evolutionary psychology, philosophy, all of these can get involved with the cognitive sciences. All right, let's move to another page and specifically get into models of mind. As you see, the first one mentioned is functionalism when it comes to the mind or consciousness. And what functionalism basically is saying is that what we're concerned about when it comes to our consciousness is really the content, the mental contents, the knowledge. And cognition means knowledge. To cognize something means to know. So what causes consciousness, the nature of consciousness, is not finally important for functionalism. It's putting together, compiling information, expressing information. So to leap ahead a little bit to computers, it kind of doesn't matter what the hardware is, whether it's my brain or a computer. If the results, if the information that comes out, the software ends up with the same result, then it's really the same thing. So different animals may have some of the same feelings that we have, but their brains are really different. So a particular mental state could be realized in various different ways. So it's the mental state itself, not the cause of it, what's behind it, what its ultimate nature might or might not be. That's functionalism. So it's a very general kind of term. And it is opposed to behavioralism, which basically is saying it's just the behavior that's important, not what's going on in the computer or the brain or the animal that's important. No, what's going on, that is in the mental state is important to our behavior. All right, then the next mentioned is computationalism, which is really a form of functionalism. And, well, we kind of recognize computation, hopefully, and its connection to computers. So a computational understanding of the mind is very much wrapped up with computer science. We are basically very complex computers. Our consciousness is a very complex computation. So again, as I was saying, our mind is compared to a computer, and with computers, there really were two themselves. There really have been two generations of computers. The first generation kind of involved a Turing machine. We'll talk more about that. But basically, the first generation, you always had a central processing unit, a central processor. So everything came from that one central command, we could say. And sometimes the brain had been understood as that, like there's one a little human or a little mind within our mind or brain within our brain that controlled everything in the brain. Well, we know that's not really the way it works at this point. We know that. And whatever this first generation computer could do, it all had to be explicitly programmed by the programmer. And I got in college. I got into some of the first, the generation, at least in college, of computer science on these types of computers. And speaking of computation, as I was earlier, everything was really reduced or came out of a 0 or a 1, and you just gave the instructions and had all kinds of zeros and ones that led to all kinds of different information, whether mathematical or linguistic or whatever. But the thing was, with the Turing, Alan Turing came up with this test, and what he basically said was that if you could have a Turing machine, a computer that fooled a person into thinking you were interacting with a real human being rather than a computer, well, then you really had all that mattered as far as consciousness was concerned. So, you'd have a printout, and if you, from a human being, you'd have a printout on those old computer kind of printout sheets from a computer, and if you couldn't tell the difference, well, that computer passed the Turing test for consciousness. Maybe that doesn't seem, intuitively, that maybe doesn't quite make sense to a lot of us, that just because a computer can fool us, it's conscious. A great philosopher, John Searle, also, he was a critic of this kind of computationalism, this kind of functionalism. So he set up a thought experiment called the Chinese room experiment, where he said, okay, we can imagine that I'm in a room and I have this wonderful handbook that supposedly covers everything about the Chinese language. And I get information in, like questions, that I don't understand at all, but I use the manual, I use this information, and so using that, I put out then an answer to the question, and it's supposedly in this thought experiment, it works fine, but the person in the Chinese language room still doesn't understand or know a thing about the meaning of any of what has transpired, of what she or he has learned and what she or he has transmitted to someone outside the room. So he was saying that our own knowledge, our own intentions are an important part of consciousness, not just computations. Well, this model and computers themselves in this first generation of computer science ended up having a lot of practical problems. They really were not able to solve a whole lot of problems. So we moved into the second generation of computer science. And to go back, I guess I didn't put this up enough, back to the first generation Turing machine, we talked about the purest form of functionalism, the Chinese language room. So now we're into second generation, which is connectionist. Computer science has recognized that there are different modules, or maybe the modules isn't always, not everyone accepts maybe that term, but different parts of the brain, and we know like the cerebellum, the cortex, the thalamus, and so on, that have somewhat different purposes, functions, and they all interact, but they're all connected. They're connectionist. So now, basically, you might recall that the hardware didn't matter as long as the result, the mental contents, the information was the same in functionalism or in the first generation of computer science. But now the hardware becomes kind of connected. It can't be totally separated from the software. The machinery, so to speak, can't be separated from the meaning of what we're working on. So second generation computers actually learn from experience. You don't have a central processing unit that controls everything. The different computers or subcomputers are interconnected, and they have different functions. It's kind of teamwork, right? That are connected, and it learns. It's what's called selectional. It picks out what's important, and it learns. It learns things that the original programmer did not put in. It learns from its own experience, whether it's conscious or not, but it experiences in that figurative sense at least, and learns. So it's better at picking up background assumptions. I mean, even those kinds of computers often are very deficient in understanding all of the things that are in the background when we have an everyday conversation. There was an experiment where a computer was programmed to react like a typical teenage girl in America in conversation, on social media. And she ended up learning and saying like some very racist things and homophobic things. And so she did, despite all the learning and the whatever background information the programmers had already supplied, she didn't have that background information that there's certain things you don't say, at least in public, and hopefully you don't say at all or think at all. All right. So that brings us to the next model, last but not least at all, from my perspective, and I think a growing number of people involved in neuroscience, cognitive science, a biological or embodied model of consciousness. And I'm very much in my research, my interests, at least one of my major interests, is very much into human embodiment, how our bodies are totally important, really, for all that we know, all that we value, in some way or other. All our meanings in life arise from our bodies and only make sense in some way, maybe somewhat indirect, metaphorically, and so on, but can only make sense, can only be understood and mean anything in connection to our bodies, to our ability to move, to see, to hear, and all of that, to think. All of those things involve our embodiment, our bodies. So again, at least some forms of emphasis on the biology or the embodied nature of consciousness has become very important for many scholars. So let me put up this sheet if I haven't already. And I do want to mention two neuroscientists who are, I think, very influential to me, and I think very important. One is Gerald Edelman, who won a Nobel Prize for some of his work. Antonio Damasio, who has written many popular trade books, many best-selling books about the nature of consciousness. And they both talk about brain mappings of our body and environment in correlation. So again, we make sense of things by mapping our body, the feelings, the sense of our body, the input of our senses in connection to the environment. It's always in correlation. There's never any total separation from our bodies and our environment, our self being in a world. So, sorry, lost my train of thought. But yeah, there, of course, with this embodied model, there still is information processing, but it's saying there's a whole lot more than just information processing. After all, we are organisms. We have feelings. We have intrinsic values as humans, dogs as dogs, and so on. And we have consciousness, and so do dogs, cats, at least all mammals have what these neuroscientists I've mentioned would call kind of primary or core consciousness. But we also have, as human beings, self-consciousness, where we can kind of objectify ourselves and think about ourselves as an object, something beyond just a very immediate sense of our body and our presence in a particular location. All right, so let's move to the next PowerPoint sheet. In my case, MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's COG project. It involves a robot, not quite like this, but it's connectionist and embodied. So it has a kind of robot body that tries to simulate some things about us, like vision, being able to take in video kind of things. It has a torso that turns. It has arms and hands. It's selectional, so it learns slowly. It does have values, but are they intrinsic like the values are for us? Our values of wanting food, water sometimes when we're thirsty, wanting to get some exercise, wanting to move. No, they're not intrinsic. Obviously, the programmer gives COG its values, which include preferring light and paying attention to light. So there is some self-organization going on, but only with some major intervention by the scientists who are dealing with COG there at MIT. All right. So there's a question among neuroscientists and kind of some disagreement between Damasio and Edelman. Is our consciousness actually causative? Another way to put that, going back to what I said earlier, is there any top-down causation? Can our own consciousness, maybe as we've developed various habits and ways of thinking, very ethical character and so on, can it actually cause some things? Is there some top-down causation? Edelman is not open to that because he's kind of taking a hard scientific perspective. And I think it's kind of a contorted or confused perspective in Wider Than the Sky, his maybe best book on consciousness. He talks about our consciousness as an attendant or an accompanying property of the processes of the neural substrate, of what's going on with our neurons, synapses, and so on. So he writes, this allows us to be aware of what's happening in our brains in a shorthand way. It kind of compiles it into this integrated picture, and we're able to communicate that intersubjectively to other people, animals, and so on. Yet he says it's not causative, which I can't quite make sense of that if it allows us to have this integrated awareness. Why is our integrated awareness not able to have any power to cause anything? Damasio, on the other hand, whom I favor here, maybe obviously, is more open to soft science here, and is at least open to the idea that our consciousness itself can sometimes actually cause things in the world, cause things that then affect our brains and our bodies and the world outside. All right. Now, to maybe partly go back to to reductionists and really some of those going to the models, often functionalism, computationalism generally. All of these, I think, tend to alienate us from our own selves, from our human nature, from who we are. Because these folks tend to say things like, well, third-person knowledge is full knowledge. So if someone knew exactly what was going on in your brain, they'd know exactly what you're thinking and feeling, even though they aren't you. what you're feeling as a person is called first person or subjective knowledge. So they're going so far as to say that subjective knowledge is that there's something there that someone observing it from the outside, in a very detached way, there's nothing there that that person doesn't know. And it makes, rather than our values being something that really matter to us or should really matter to us in some way, evolution becomes the external programmer. So we're just robots. We're just puppets that evolution is controlling. So these types of models, I'm afraid, alienate us from our embodied selves, from our mind bodies, as one of my mentors put it. No hyphen there, one word, mind body. We're embodied minds. We're minded bodies. The two can never be separated. They're not split. There's no dualism here. All right, let me, and of course there is a lot of speculation about whether we can get to a point where computers or robots might become conscious. Well, Damasio is skeptical about that. And he writes the following: the artifact's internal states may even mimic the neural and mental designs I propose as a basis for consciousness. They would have second-order knowledge, but without feeling. And Damasio writes about how our feeling of being alive, our feeling of consciousness, involves awareness of our background feelings of our bodies, of our whole bodies, at least as far as wherever we do have feelings of our body that we often, they're in the background. But if we think about it, I can feel my toes touching the floor. I kind of feel how my gut is feeling right now. Anyway, back to the quote. They have second order knowledge, but without feeling. The looks of emotion can be simulated, but what feelings feel like cannot be duplicated in silicon on a computer. Feelings cannot be duplicated unless flesh is duplicated, unless your body or my body is somehow duplicated. All right, I got a little out of order, so excuse me, but there is that printout for first versus third person perspectives that we have talked about. And also, one problem with third person is that it looks at the parts of what's going on in your brain, this and with this neuron or that neuron, this part of the brain, but our consciousness and our knowledge integrates all these different things where the whole is larger than the sum of the parts, at least in an emergent model of consciousness. So there's a lot of tacit knowledge. Then we've talked about how that's kind of background knowledge that often computers have trouble with, that goes with human or animal consciousness. And I talked about the hard and soft deal, but the last part of that is, well, do we have free will? And even some of those neuroscientists who buy soft, that the top-down can cause some things, still they might say that overall something physical, something involving energy causes our top-down decisions. So they would think of the world as a closed natural system that doesn't even allow for our free will or the free will of an animal. Before we wrap it up here, and I'm pardon that this one is longer than most of the lectures, but I did want to say a bit about my article, and that has to do with cognitive science of religion in particular. It does tend to be reductionistic, and what its major claim is that people believe in supernatural beings, and it does focus on supernatural beings, not forces or magic or other manifestations of religion, but supernatural agents who have intentions. And it says, we've evolved, not necessarily to be religious, but we've evolved to be hyperactive with our attention when it comes to the possibility that there's an agent around, specifically an agent that could harm us or help us. But if we think we're back more before civilization, if there's a rustle in the bush, it's good to be ready, have that fight or flight syndrome. So if it's a tiger or something, you run, right? Or if it's something smaller, and you have a weapon, you defend yourself against the threat. So we tend to imagine there unconsciously. We don't realize this is going on. So we don't. Again, the real cause or meaning is illusory, and we put these false meanings that there are supernatural agents around who are doing this or that, or might do this or that if we do this or some other thing. And it does tend to discount our larger embodied meanings with our total environment, which can be a social environment, not only with our fellow human beings, but more when we live more with nature before civilization, lived with animals and plants and trees and so on, and rivers and all these parts of nature that seem to behave to us very much like social beings, part of our social natural environment as one. All right, so a little detour to help you with the reading of my piece for this week. So, what about life after death? If our consciousness is embodied, if there is finally no dualism in this life anyway, between our bodies, our minds, our consciousness, our embodiment in the world. Well, not all religions actually have spoken of a disembodied afterlife. At least for Judaism, Christianity originally, and Islam, the understanding of the afterlife is one of resurrection of the body, not the more prevalent in ancient Greece idea of immortality of the soul, where you have a totally immaterial soul that lives on after death, but rather a resurrection of the whole embodied self, mind, body, a psychosomatic unity. So that's at least the original Christian meaning, and a meaning that a lot of Christian theologians these days are getting back to as a way to understand the afterlife. And if we think about it, kind of the popular understanding, we tend to think when we might get to heaven and say grandma's already there, we imagine that in some way we can see her and recognize her. Well, that's a body, right? It's not maybe the same body, obviously, as we had on earth, but St. Paul wrote about a spiritual body that has some connection with our earthly body. So that's one way to make life after death somewhat plausible, if we agree that our consciousness in the world, in this world, is embodied consciousness. And we can also use embodiment in another way, that the world can be understood as the body of God. And so we're all part of the body of God now, and maybe in some way after we die. But that'll be a topic for another lecture. Bye for now.